Here's a story of why you should never disrespect the dead, especially those of other cultures. But before we begin, if you like our content, please press that like button the way I press the elevator button to make it arrive faster, and remember to subscribe to our channel if you like what we do here. Richard was a 40-something-year-old English banker sent by his company to work in the finance sector in Singapore in 1991. He wasn't a very religious man, and in fact valued practicality above all else, which at times put him at odds with his family, who were all staunch Catholics. Singapore is a small island nation in Southeast Asia with a population of only 7 million at the time of this recording. It was a strategic former colony of the British Empire, and although the entire country is smaller than cities such as Berlin, Germany, and New York City, it's now widely considered one of the most prosperous nations in the world. Back in 1991, as Singapore was on its way to becoming an economic powerhouse, Richard was sent there by his financial institution to be part of the management staff of the new international branch they were opening there. Singapore has always been a multicultural society, which includes Malays, Indians, Eurasians, and Caucasians, with English as one of its main languages. But it's predominantly ethnic Chinese, making up approximately 75% of the population. Richard had arrived in Singapore in August. This was during a period of the year that the Chinese call the 7th month. Many ethnic Chinese around the world still follow the lunar calendar when it comes to traditional events, and the lunar 7th month is typically in August or September. More importantly though, this is a time the Chinese believe when once a year, the gates of hell are opened and the souls of the deceased are allowed to roam the earth for 1 month. Now, Richard wasn't entirely happy about his company sending him halfway across the world to spend several years in a foreign country. But he'd be paid very well for this by the time his tenure here was done, so he wasn't too adverse to the idea either. So, he did his best to settle in quickly to his new surroundings and getting to know his new co-workers. During his first week, Richard was always seeing all the locals burning all these joss sticks, which are similar to incense sticks, but instead are used for prayer, and burning all these bits and sheets of paper with these red designs, numbers, and symbols, as well as leaving orange-colored cakes and various food items everywhere along the sides of the roads and under buildings. So he asked one of his co-workers, who was a local Singaporean named Ming, "Hey Ming, what are those things everyone's burning? And why are they leaving food out?" So Ming explained to him, "Oh, those are joss sticks and what we call hell money. The joss sticks, hell money, and food are offerings we make to the roaming spirits of the dead during the 7th month to appease them and ask for good fortune. We sometimes call these spirits hungry ghosts. Try your best not to disturb the offerings. If you do, you should ask for forgiveness." Now, when Richard heard this, he kinda just dismissed it with a little pff, and said something along the lines of, "Bollocks, there's no such things as ghosts." The next week, Richard was walking home late one night by himself after a rather bad day at work. One of his important business deals had fallen through. So he was just trudging along by the side of the road, making his way home while his mind was distracted with thoughts of the failed deal and another vital meeting he had tomorrow. While deep in thought, Richard suddenly felt something on the underside of his shoes. He stopped walking, and when he looked down to see what it was, he realized he had accidentally stepped on the half-burnt remains of some joss sticks and hell money. Now, in fairness, it was a little dark and these things were all along the roadside, but Richard, who wasn't in the best of moods anyway, got rather annoyed by this. The ashes had made his shoes all dirty, and he exclaimed, "Bloody hell, not my fault I didn't see it in the dark. I only have 2 eyes, you know." And Richard also didn't want to have to make the effort to step slowly and cautiously around all these things that were littered everywhere. So Richard just kicked the ashes, joss sticks, and bits of food offerings that were in his path aside, and just stepped on the hell money along the way as he continued walking, all the while mumbling complaints to himself. The rest of the night was pretty uneventful. In fact, by the time Richard went to bed, he had forgotten all about the walk home that night. Richard woke up the next morning with a jolt. He sat up suddenly with this excruciating, splitting headache. It was hurting so bad he felt like he couldn't even move. He realized the source of the pain came from the back of his head. He reached back and put his hands on the back of his head to hold it, to hopefully ease some of the pain, which of course didn't work. But even in his agony, he realized the back of his head felt weird. There wasn't a lump or anything he could physically feel with his fingers, but it still felt strange. But no matter what he was feeling, Richard knew he had to go into work today because of the vital important meeting he had. So he did his best to get himself ready through the pain and made his way to the office. Later that day, after the meeting, Richard's co-worker, Ming, was worried about him. Ming approached Richard from behind while Richard was sitting at his desk facing the other way, and even before he reached Richard, or could call his name, Richard asked what Ming wanted. Now, Ming was a little taken aback by this. He asked Richard how he knew it was he, Ming, behind him. And Richard just said, "I don't know, I just sort of knew you were there." Ming didn't think any more of it, then said to Richard, "We're all a little worried about you. You were really off in the meeting. That was very unlike you. You looked like you couldn't concentrate, you were fidgeting the whole time, your hands were clutching the back of your head. You look unwell. Are you okay?" Richard replied, "I've been having these really bad headaches since last night." Ming then told him, "You should see a doctor." But then Richard said, "It's alright. I'm sure it'll go away by the end of the day or tomorrow." But Richard would be wrong. 2 more days would go by, and Richard's head was still constantly pounding and hurting. He couldn't concentrate at all at work, and he couldn't even sleep well. In fact, every time he lay down on his back, he'd feel these strange sensations on the back of his head where the aches originated from. Like there was something there. He'd reach back with his hand to feel if there was anything there, but obviously there wasn't, so Richard finally decided to visit a doctor. Richard told the doctor everything about the intense, constant migraines he was having, how it felt like it all centered on the back of his head, and how he felt like there was something there on the back of his head, but he didn't know what. Weirder still, he told the doctor how he felt like he could tell what was going on behind him. Like he just knew. Now, the doctor found this last part of what Richard was saying somewhat odd. He'd never heard anyone ever complaining about knowing what's going on behind their backs before. So the doctor decided to do a little test. He stood behind Richard and asked him to guess how many fingers he was holding up. Richard paused for a second, then said 3. The doctor was slightly surprised. Richard was right. He was holding up 3 fingers behind Richard's head. The doctor then decided to up the difficulty. He used both hands now and asked Richard to guess again. This time Richard said 7. The doctor was now intrigued. Richard was right again. The doctor repeated this test with Richard 10 more times, and sure enough, Richard was correct every single time. The doctor was stunned. The odds of Richard getting it correct that number of times was ridiculously low. Now, although all this seemed sort of unbelievable, nevertheless, the doctor was a busy man, so he chalked it all up to some crazy coincidence, gave Richard a bunch of medication, and told him he'd be well and back to normal in a day or 2. But the doctor would be wrong. 3 more days went by, and even though Richard was taking his medication religiously, he was still having constant, agonizing pain in the back of his head. Not to mention the weird sensations back there seemed to only be getting stronger too. Richard returned to the doctor, but the doctor checked him again and still could not figure out what was wrong. The doctor told Richard he could of course go for a brain scan, but Richard wasn't too keen on that idea. It would be very expensive, and it would take some time before Richard could get an appointment slot. Meanwhile, Ming, Richard's co-worker, was feeling really bad for him. Richard had been on sick leave for a few days, but when he came back to the office, he looked even worse than he did before he went on leave. While talking, Ming said to Richard, "You know, maybe it's because of something that happened to you or something you did the day before you started getting the headaches." Although it was getting rather difficult for Richard to think very straight, he suddenly remembered his walk back home the night before the headaches began. In between moans, Richard told Ming about how he had stepped on the burnt remains of joss sticks and hell money, and how he had kicked all the ashes and food offerings around all along the path. Ming immediately had this worried look on his face. He paused, then told Richard in a deathly serious tone, "You have to go see a monk right now." Richard wanted to laugh, but the pain was stopping him. There was no way this could be because of some supernatural phenomenon. There's no such things as ghosts. Skip forward a few days, so it's now been over 2 weeks since Richard first got the headaches, and nothing's changed. He was still in constant suffering. Ming was still pestering him daily to go visit a monk, and eventually, Richard relented. By this time, Richard was thinking to himself he just couldn't take it a moment longer. He just wanted the pain and weird sensations to stop, even if it meant doing something he didn't believe in, like seeking divine intervention. So, following Ming's recommendation, Richard simply left the office and went straight to one of the country's oldest temples in Chinatown. When Richard tried stepping through the temple's huge wooden door frames, an old, short, bald monk in an orange robe came up to him and gently requested him to remove his shoes. Richard apologized and complied. After Richard had stepped into the actual main hall of the temple, before he could even say anything, the old monk glared at him, first with suspicion, then with a knowing but troubled look. Then the monk said solemnly to Richard, "There is something bad in you." The monk proceeded to look Richard up and down, like he was doing a visual examination of him. And when he went around behind Richard and looked up at the back of his head, the monk let out an audible gasp. He immediately asked Richard, "Have you been feeling like you can see behind you?" Richard was surprised by the monk's words, and straight away told the monk all about his terrible headaches, the strange feeling in the back of his head, and how he just knew things that were happening behind him, even though he wasn't looking directly at them. The monk nodded the whole time as Richard was recounting his experiences. When Richard was done, the monk looked at him with a half-serious, half-sympathetic expression on his face, and said to Richard, "That's because you have eyes in the back of your head." The monk asked Richard the same thing Richard's coworker Ming had asked him the week before. Did anything unusual happen the day before he started having these migraines? And Richard told the monk the exact same thing he told Ming about stepping on and kicking around all the spiritual offerings on his way home that night. Without hesitation, the monk immediately explained to Richard that his actions that night of disturbing and disrespecting the offerings had offended a mischievous, hungry ghost. So the ghost decided to attach itself to Richard's body and make him suffer by causing Richard all these headaches and weird feelings. But the ghost had attached itself to Richard backwards. And what the monk could see as a holy person was the ghost's eyes peeking out the back of Richard's head. Now, Richard's first instinct was to dismiss everything the monk was saying. There was no way any of this was real. Ghosts aren't real. The supernatural isn't real. But the more Richard thought about it, the more it became the only explanation that made sense. Besides, what did Richard have to lose now? The monk ushered Richard and sat him down directly in front of a couple of huge statues of deities in the temple. The statues were about 5 meters tall. Richard had no idea who they were, but they looked somehow both imposing yet comforting at the same time. The monk chanted and prayed over Richard for a couple of minutes. After that, he gave Richard a set of joss sticks, food offerings, and hell money, the same kind Richard had seen everywhere. The monk instructed Richard to return to the exact location where he had disrespected the offerings previously, to go back there tonight and make his own offerings and pray for forgiveness. Richard collected all the offerings and thanked the monk profusely. He wanted to give the monk something, like maybe some small donation, but the monk politely refused, and told him to just come back to the temple and look for him again tomorrow after he's completed the ritual. So that very night, Richard made his way back to the spot by the sidewalk where he had first stepped on the offerings. He set up his own offerings, the ones that were given to him and blessed by the monk. He knelt down on the ground and humbly prayed for forgiveness for his previous actions. The very next morning, when Richard woke up, he noticed right away that the headaches were completely gone. For the first time in more than 2 weeks, his mind was clear and he could think straight. He used his hand to touch the back of his head and he felt nothing. No more strange sensations. He was completely back to normal. That very evening after work, he headed straight for the temple to see the old short monk again. He couldn't stop saying thank you over and over again. But the monk just said he was happy to help someone in need. And even though the monk told him it wasn't necessary if he didn't want to, Richard made a donation of half of his month's pay to the temple. From then on, Once a month, without fail, until the end of his time in Singapore, Richard would go to the temple to pay his respects and visit the old monk. And during every Hungry Ghost Festival, in the 7th month of the lunar calendar, Richard would be extra careful and respectful, and even made offerings himself. By the time he left Singapore, which would be several years later, I think it's fair to say that Richard was no longer completely skeptical when it came to the supernatural. And that's it for today. Thank you for listening to 15 More or Less. Please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy what we do here. It really helps our channel, and we appreciate it immensely. If there's a story you'd like us to cover, or have a story of your own you'd like us to share, you can email us or leave a comment below. I'm M15, thanks for listening, and see you guys in the next story.